Thank you, Andrew, very much. Isn't John Coleman awesome? You know, we take great pride in John doing so well, especially since he was terrible at making copies and getting coffee. You know, some people just aren't cut out for the little things, John. We're really glad that you found your purpose and that you're doing so well. It's wonderful to be here in Orlando. You know, being here does come at a cost. It's a little disorienting being away from Washington, D.C., where you have the warm and watchful gaze of the federal government to keep you comfortable. You know, I don't know if, show of hands maybe, who really feels like Joe Biden has his finger on the pulse of the American life? You know, say it with me, what do we need most? 87,000 new IRS agents. No? That's not the priority? It's almost like the administration's a little bit out of touch with the American people. My theory on what's happening in Washington, I derive from my old mentor, Stan Evans. He said in Washington we have two parties and only two, the evil party and the stupid party. And I'm a proud member of the stupid party. But every once in a while, the evil party and the stupid party come together and they do something, and that's called bipartisanship. So here's the good news. Here's the good news. We don't do stupid and evil, we do conservative and correct. And, you know, as Andrew said, this is my third tour of duty at Heritage, and I sometimes get the question, why come back? And I will tell you, Heritage is the absolutely indispensable institution, right? Heritage is the indispensable institution. As goes the Heritage Foundation, so goes the conservative movement, and as goes the conservative movement, so goes the United States of America. So that's why you're here. We care deeply about Heritage, we care passionately about the conservative freedom movement, and we care wholeheartedly, without reservation, about the greatness of America. So why now, though, right? I spent a lot of time in corporate America. The more we play the old-fashioned way, the more it's unacceptable to be a conservative. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the bow ties are off and the brass knuckles are on. And that doesn't mean we swing indiscriminately, but it means, as Kevin said this morning, we're on offense all the time. The hippies of the 60s have gone from virtuous victims to vicious offensiveness. And to them, their agenda is so important that there's no such thing as too far or too fast. Well, they need to know that we won't get forced into corners and that we won't bend or break, and we will remain on offense everywhere, all the time, and as Kay James says, on every issue. And so, thank you. You know, and I love talking about offense because I'm a former quarterback. So my job was to get the hands in the ball of the playmakers, and so that's why I'm delighted to partner here with Tommy Binion, Mike Gonzalez, and Dakota Wood for this conversation. As we bring them up on stage, we're going to put a definition up here to tell you what is woke and what is CRT. Right? Woke is the past tense of wake up, someone who has woken up to issues of social justice. This is the popular definition. It comes from African American culture and slang. It's popular in music and things like that. And it's made its way from sort of popular culture into our dictionaries and our definitions. Critical race theory is a framework of analysis that views everything through the lens of race and all parties as oppressor or oppressed. And so we wanted to sort of level set the conversation with these definitions. And so when the Black Lives Matter organization was rioting in the streets, senior fellow Mike Gonzalez went on offense, bringing transparency to their agenda, eviscerating their attempts to achieve their Marxist goals, so much so that they scrubbed their website. When our top military brass shockingly showed that they had no brass, senior fellow Dakota Wood took them to task on CRT and highlighted how it was inherently divisive, inherently anti-team, and inherently anti-American, and how it would destroy our military. And through it all, as the aggressive progressives were doing everything they can, including trying to eliminate words like father, mother, daughter, and son from our federal code, our VP of Government Relations, Tommy Binion, deployed his team to flood the Hill with the right defensive positions, but also with the right offensive policy recommendations. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my colleagues, and let's get on with our conversation. All right, so Tommy, what just happened in Virginia? We saw that parents were outraged and they responded. What's the takeaway?
Well, I am a Virginia parent. I've got a 5.5-year-old and an almost 3-year-old, and they're my pride and joy, and they're going to go to school in Virginia. And so I was thrilled with the election results, but not just because Glenn Youngkin won, but because of the way that election was contested. It was contested by conservatives leaning in to cultural issues and leaning into fighting wokeism and responding in an organic, non-political, non-organized type of way, but in the way that parents would respond when they get genuinely concerned about what's going on in their classroom. And then the left truly began to reveal itself. Right? Terry McAuliffe said that parents have no right to even discuss what is taught in their child's classroom, and that is where the organic backlash got really bad, and that is what put the conservatives over the top. I was even more thrilled when Mrs. James and our director of our Center for Education, Lindsay Burke, were named to the transition team. As a Virginia parent, Mrs. James, that makes me very happy. I don't know if Lindsay Burke is here, but I can't wait to tell her congratulations, because the way she thinks about education is exactly how the Commonwealth of Virginia should be thinking about it. What does it mean? What is the takeaway? The title of this panel is Winning the War on Wokeism. Folks, all Virginia was we announced ourselves on the battlefield. We have not begun to win battles yet, but two pieces of good news. Wokeism is not built to win battles. The purpose of wokeism is to intimidate us to stay quiet. And that's not going to happen anymore that we are on the battlefield. Wokeism is internally inconsistent, and it is fundamentally counter to American values. And so, yes, we've only begun to announce ourselves on the battlefield, but it won't be long until we can truly declare that we are winning the war on wokeism.
That's it's a great segue to the question, Mike, for you. You know, at Resource Bank in June, we had Ian Pryor there to talk. He was on a panel with Rob Bluey. It was a great conversation. But Ian talked about the fight. He was leading Fight for Schools in Loudoun County. You know, Mike's been traveling around the country. Mike wrote the book on BLM. Heritage Action has been in all of these states and in a lot of different districts. Mark Levin comes out, Mike, and says, you know, Mike Gonzalez and the Heritage Foundation were talking about critical race theory before anybody else. But as you make this tour around the country, did what we see in Virginia percolate everywhere else? Are we on the front end of a tidal wave?
Thanks, Andy, and thanks all of you for what you do. Look, I started my present tour in Loudoun County on June 12th in a very raucous meeting with activists and parents outside of a government building in Leesburg on June 12th. Since then, I've traveled to maybe 25 to 30 cities talking to Americans from all walks of life, coast to coast. And they all mention Loudoun County. They all say Loudoun County was ground zero. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was in Europe for a week in Spain and in Brussels. And I said, as I spoke around, that Virginia was going to be the first weather belt, the first thing to look for. And now I notice that people who are at my conference are all over social media really watching this. The Europeans are watching what we're doing. The Europeans are watching, they want America to lead. They want conservatives in America to lead. I think Virginia was I think it was a Lexington of sorts, a Lexington and Concord. But I think you're right. I think that the parents that I'm meeting are really upset about what they're seeing. And the reason for that is when critical race theory first came into being as a discipline in the late 80s, they were very quick to win major battles. They became dominant in the field of civil rights inside of universities, and they defeated all of their opponents very quickly, and they remained dominant in the faculty lounge for about 30 years, but their impact on social policy and public policy was very limited, except maybe in the K through 12 field, where they started to make inroads about 10 years ago. But then 2020 happened, and the disturbances that we saw, the riots, the 600 plus riots that we saw, the costliest civil disturbance in US history, allowed critical race theory to jump the lab. A line that I use when I speak around the country is that two bad viruses jumped the lab in 2020, COVID-19 in Wuhan and CRT here in the United States. And it met opposition for the first time in the American people. And they don't know what to do. They're really concerned because I think we conservatives are doing this well for the first time in a long time. We're winning a cultural battle, which we're not used to doing, because we're exposing what they want to do. I think the American people haven't read essays by Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw, but they get at a gut level that this is an attempt to overthrow the American system. This is what it is. Critical race theory is an attempt to overthrow the American system, and they get it. And that's the reason why they're so upset, and that's the reason why we're winning for the first time in a long time.
And if you're going to be in a fight, you want Dakota Wood, who spent 20 years in the Marine Corps, on our side. Happy Veterans Day, Dakota. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
So, Dakota, parents are outraged in Virginia. You see a result in the election. Mike travels the country. You see it everywhere else. Are veterans outraged, military families? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that's where the battle really is outside of the military, right? So unlike teachers' unions across the country who've become political entities in their own right, we actually don't want the military to become an independent political entity, right? Civilian control of the military, that's a hallmark of the American system, and it's why we don't have problems like Pakistan and other countries where the military throws around its own weight. So there are things that the military, they salute smartly, they follow orders, they're going to implement the directions from the civilians over them to the best of their ability. They cannot say, this is a bad idea, we're not going to do it, right? So then it falls to the American public, to those of us here in the room, to stand up and push back, just like parents have pushed back against school boards and against school administrations, right? It's the veteran community that stands up and says, look, I know my own experience. I was in a unit and I served with Latinos and African Americans and men and women and country kids and city kids, really the melting pot of America. I mean, that's what the United States is, right? And we all were merit-based. We all came into boot camp. You went through the same obstacle course. You were at the same rifle range. You had to meet the same physical fitness standards. And so if you were advanced to a particular rank or put into a particular position, you were respected because you had earned that. It wasn't a tokenism, right? That because of your skin color or gender or whatever that might be, we need an equal representation across the service or the unit that somehow reflects this idealized machination of ideologies in the country, right? And so they understood respect, honor, commitment to a higher ideal, and a meritocracy that can be the only measure of effectiveness when you get onto a battlefield. If I've ordered somebody in my unit to charge the machine gun nest, you can't have that person think, was I selected because of my ethnic background or my religious identity or something like that, right? It's a team building exercise to grow young Marines and soldiers and sailors and airmen. They get out there where they respect each other, because if they get wounded, who cares what the background is of the medic or the corpsman that renders support or that's putting fuel in the airplane, right? Wokeism, critical race theory, et cetera, seeks to blow that up, that we should look at each other not in the uniform and not based on our experience to get the rank and achieve the skills that you've done by dint of hard work, but I should identify you by your skin color, or whether you've got a funny accent, or you're from the city or from the country, right? All these sorts of things that are divisive and really destructive to the cohesion and the effectiveness of military operations and units. I mean, it's the antithesis of that. So I think on this battleground where parents have stood up to school boards, where we're seeing public outrage at understanding the divisive character of critical race theory and these other ideologies, right? This is an area where the American public need to break down the doors of their representatives, to make their voice heard that we're not going to tolerate this. Just as a personal story, my son is in the final stages of wanting to join the Marine Corps as well, right? So hopefully I've got an inside track with our incoming president where we keep this Marine Corps thing going, right? But my own wife, we've been through 15 moves. She's got the children settled from one place to another. She's lived and breathed the Marine Corps as much as I ever did. And she's asking the questions, is this a military we want our son to join? When 3 out of 4 American youth are ineligible for military service because of obesity, health problems, run-ins with the law, that remaining 1 out of 4, what is their propensity to serve? And if the view is the military is flawed, they're pitting against, the service members against each other, if we can't be proud of our country, why should they want to serve? And you talk about perceptions in Spain and elsewhere. How do you think Beijing and Moscow and Tehran is looking at the United States and our military? As a worthy opponent, or something that's weak and divided, it can be easily defeated in battle? So I just call upon you on an action item. our members here need to speak up to their local elected representatives and knock this stuff off.
That's a great point. Good, Tommy, a follow-up to that. How does this materialize in the legislative process? I mean, your team and your leadership and Heritage Action were watching, the National Defense Authorization Act, and you're seeing things like this creep into that conversation. Is it a distraction from the real issues, or is it something that's foundational to where your conversation is as you're trying to educate lawmakers?
Well, I think it's both. I think it's a distraction for the left. They have revealed their priorities to be identity politics. They have revealed adhering to wokeism to be what's most important to them. So when they see the NDAA, when they see an education authorization bill, when they see an appropriations bill, they see an opportunity to advance these causes. In this Democratic majority that we're experiencing in the present Congress, we've not seen an authorizing bill that doesn't have sexual orientation and gender identity language, SOGI language, in it. It's inherent in everything. And so it reveals their priorities, and it also distracts them from what's important. We are in crisis in this country. There is a crisis on the border. There are Americans trapped in Afghanistan. Inflation is at a 30-year high, and on and on and on. And yet the State Department is sponsoring a pronoun day. That reveals their priorities. It shows they're distracted. It's the same in Washington as it is in certain corporate headquarters in America, where they are distracted from delivering for their shareholders and delivering the best product to trying to appease the left and their woke values. That was my second piece of good news, by the way. In my first answer, I said I would give you two pieces of good news. The second piece is that they are distracted by this. And we can deliver our common sense conservative solutions to those crises, and people will understand where we're coming from.
Yeah, I think make a moderator's privilege here, but one of the things that John mentioned is, BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard. There's this little hedge fund called Engine Number One, and a couple years ago they bought stock in ExxonMobil, and they were trying to make some changes as a sort of climate activist group, and they didn't have much success. Well, this past year at their shareholder meeting, Exxon got 3 new board members, and they're 3 climate activists. And they were able to do this because BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard all supported the proposal of each board member put forth by Engine Number One. And so if you think about the environmental, social, and governance, you think about shareholder proposals, and you think about that weaponization of capital, 3 climate activists on the board of ExxonMobil, I mean, for them to be successful, you would shut down the operations, you'd turn out the lights, and you'd lock the doors. That's the weaponization of capital. That's what they would want to do with Exxon, and now they're on the board. And so you see these things happen, and you think about, what can we do? We can vote our shares, we can call our investment managers and say, where are you putting our money? And if you're a custodian for our dollars, are you working against my values? I think that's something that's so important, and I'm glad that Tommy touched on it. Mike, one of the things that you did and you exposed right before you wrote your book on BLM is the way corporations just quickly latched onto BLM. Is there a spine left at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce?
Yeah, I don't have much hope, and I think John touched on it very well with BlackRock. Look, Black Lives Matter raised $100 million last year alone, and that's the amount that, and this is the organization, the main organization, the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. They raised $100 million, and that's what they admitted to have raised. They may have raised more. They're not particularly transparent. These companies are giving, they have many different reasons. I don't have a degree in psychology. There are many different reasons why they give this money. One is actually, obviously, to virtue signal, but they also want to hide. They want to conceal their bad practices. They want to conceal the fact that they're not doing right by the American people. So it's a cheap way for them to do this. But so the reason I wrote my book was to shed light on this, because why? The media was not shedding light on it. The media, when it talks about Black Lives Matter, really only talks about the concept. I take no issue with the concept of Black Lives Matter, actually. I don't say all lives matter. Obviously, all our lives do matter, but I think it's important to affirm that Black Lives matter for reasons that don't need to be explained. But the media, all they talk about is the concept. They don't talk about the organizations and their founders. And that's what my book is about. That's what I go around the country talking about. The organizations and their founders want to overthrow the system. They want to overthrow the American system. They say this, they're not quoted by the media. When Alicia Garza gets up and she says, we have to work really hard to dismantle the organizing principle of American society, that's a very totalizing view. And this is what they want to do. When you Google Black Lives Matter, Google doesn't take you to a beautiful concept. It doesn't take you to my neighbor's lawn with her sign. It takes you to Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, a real thing, a real entity that exists to overthrow who we are. I think I see it as my job to expose this, to make it harder for corporations to actually shovel money at them.
You know, we're going to take some questions from the audience, so we look forward to that. You know, before we do that, Mike, just one last thing. You know, as you've gone around the country, one of the anecdotes that you share is what John Lewis said on his deathbed, and I think it's an important one because it tells you about, you know, the story of America and what we are doing as a country to live out the true meaning of our creed. But go ahead and share what John Lewis said on his deathbed.
Well, I mean, it was the second time this happened to John Lewis. He said right before he died last year, you know, he pleaded with the rioters. He said, I see you, I hear you, but rioting and looting and burning is not the way to go. Nobody listened to him. In fact, Alicia Garza made fun of him as he lay dying, and we saw the costliest civil disturbance in U.S. history. Plus, you know, I mean, the country was turned upside down. We tend to forget this now. This is the second time that it happened to John Lewis. He was overthrown by Stokely Carmichael as the head of SNCC in the 1960s because he did not want to overthrow the system then. He was an American. You know, we may not have agreed with him. He was a liberal, but he did not want to overthrow the system. I think this is what you have. The takeaway is that critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, which adheres to critical race theory, they want to overthrow the American system.
Thank you. I think we're doing questions. Do we still have time for questions? Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Question for Dakota.
Yes, sir.
If you can't hear in the back, he said, why are we all so good looking?
Just repeat the question.
Or I could repeat it.
Dakota will repeat the question.
Oh, here comes a microphone. You can change your question now.
We were going to do a Phil Donahue thing by like walking through the audience.
Oh, okay. Dakota, based on your knowledge, how far down into the midst of the military have these policies, the woke policies, CRT, gender, or whatever, have they taken root, or are they being sort of resisted and rejected? How do you see it?
Yeah, so I think the good news story is not very far. What we're seeing is this stuff espoused in public speeches and in materials produced at the very highest levels, you know, the general officer, admiral, flag officer, general officer sorts of ranks. But when you get out to the grassroots levels, most of the young men and women who join the military are inherently conservative. They come from those parts of the country. They want to challenge. They're proud of the country. They've all gone through basic training together, those sorts of things. And they're going to dismiss this kind of silliness where a training group comes in and they've got these PowerPoint slides and all the negative examples are white supremacists and all the positive examples are people looting and pillaging in the streets of, you know, Portland, Oregon, or Baltimore. So the problem here is then this increased division between the implementers of U.S. policy, right? The young troops we send to Kabul, Yemen, or other places, and their chain of command as it gets more and more senior. If you see General Milley or somebody testifying before Congress, and they are reflecting this wokeism sort of ideologies, it doesn't resonate with a common soldier, sailor, airman, right, or Marine in their lived reality within their units. You know, they're not looking at each other in these racial lenses or, you know, what their ethnic background might have been. You've been through all these things together. So I think the great danger is this division and loss of trust between the workers and the supervisors in a civilian sense, if that makes sense. The problem we have is these are all political decisions. So political appointees, the secretaries of the departments, Navy, Air Force, Army, all your chief principal civilian appointees, they take the administration's water and they're carrying that and trying to force this in, just like federal mandates, right, for companies and vaccination requirements and those sorts of things. It's being shoved down, and you see this rebellion, maybe not openly, but in social media and loss of confidence of senior leadership. So the civilian political appointees direct this to the generals and the admirals. They're going to salute and try to implement to the best they can, right? And it creates this dissension in the ranks. So it's not accepted by the lower ranks, but it certainly is causing some turmoil. And external to the military, why would you want to join that organization?
So the commander-in-chief matters, without a doubt. Other questions?
Way back in the back.
Somewhere, yeah, we got one back there.
Thank you all for being here. I do have a question, probably for Mr. Gonzalez. You talk about BLM wants to fundamentally destroy the American system or overthrow the American system. And we look at critical race theory as being so terribly divisive to our country. Where exactly is it that these groups want us to go? Can you define what that looks like? Is it socialism? Is it Marxism? Is it communism? Where are we headed because of these divisive groups?
Well, yeah, no, definitely it's Marxism. They themselves say they're Marxist. They were trained, they were trained or funded by former members of the Weather Underground, which was a Marxist terrorist group. And they say this themselves. I don't have to say this for them. I merely do what the media said it does not do, which is quote them. Look, Marx was not very open in the manifesto himself about what he saw as the alternative. He hated individual private property. He thought, and he hated the family. He thought, you know, the manifesto calls for abolishing the family. Surprise, surprise. Black Lives Matter called for abolishing the family until Andy and I wrote a piece for the New York Post. How many reads did it get finally? In the millions.
Several million. I mean, you know.
Yeah, and like good Stalin as they are, BLM airbrushed their website. They want to overthrow the criminal justice system. It's not just defunding the police. Their agenda is also to get rid of the prisons and to get rid of the courts. No society can survive that. No society has ever survived that kind, and they know that. But what they want, it's too long an answer. Maybe I can see you afterward. You can email me. They're not very clear. Marx himself was not very clear. None of the critical theorists were very clear. They just hate capitalism and individual private property.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's related to that is hating capitalism and hating private property. That's how ashamed we all are to see the business community sort of lurch on and latch onto it. I mean, if you think about it, you know, CSR, DEI, and ESG, with apologies, John, CSR, DEI, and ESG is the alphabet soup of extortion. I mean, this is top down from boards of directors, bottom up from activist employees, and outside in from activist organizations that try to pull these corporations to the left. And I think they're open to it, they're wiser to it now. And we've got a couple coalitions that we work, and we've got, you know, some advisory groups that we run, where we've just raised the volume of what's happening on the right. You know, when you're not talking to Genevieve Wood, she's on Charles Payne and on Neil Cavuto. Mrs. James is sending letters to Delta, to Coca-Cola, to MLB, and demanding meetings with them when they do things that they've just basically been pushed to do by the left. As we raise the volume on the right, you know, maybe there's a neutrality that the business community takes. Maybe that's the best scenario, but we're going to keep raising that volume. Other questions? This gentleman over here.
Thank you. Two unrelated questions, actually. For race-related issues, where is someone who is half black, half white considered in this organization?
Well, you got to read Mike's first book.
Okay, and the second part, though, is there anywhere that Heritage has published or anywhere else that shows the companies like Coca-Cola who have fallen for this and how much, so that we can boycott or personally not be involved with them?
So the first, I'll take the first question very quickly. If you have one grandfather in Mexico. If your grandmother vacationed in Mexico in the 1920s, the Census Bureau will see you as Mexican or Hispanic now. And they say that. This is it's called they call it hyperdescent. It's a fancy word for the one-drop rule. They want to maximize. They want to really get to the majority-minority country, even if it's by crook rather than by hook. But we're never going to get there because people don't behave that way. You know, the children who are born here don't have the grievances. They have to stay. Their indoctrination has to be constant. So I'm very optimistic. But yeah, no, it's as I said, it's in my book. Maybe somebody else can take the second part of the question.
Any thought on the second part of the question?
Well, the second question was, do we have an index of companies that have gone woke? We've got a history of fighting them. Andy referenced Mrs. James's letters to the CEOs of those rather large companies that were doing these things. When they pop up and when they're egregious and when they affect our members, when they affect everyday Americans, we want to fight those companies. We want to let them know what we think about that. We want to put them on record, and we want to put everyday Americans on record as opposing those things. If we're ever going to have any hope of companies stiff-arming the woke left, we are going to name them and we are going to shame them, and we're going to get people engaged. I would encourage everybody in the audience to do that as well. Make your voice heard, whether you're a shareholder, and everybody in this room is a shareholder of a lot of these companies, or you are just an engaged citizen. Make your voice heard, send them letters, engage on social media so that there is some counter pressure. Because it is not just activist shareholders and activist board members, it is everyday Americans that are pushing these companies towards wokeism.
Yeah, and I would add, you know, as part of our coalition, we work closely with ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, and they're about to publish a corporate index that'll highlight some of those bad actors. There's another group called the National Center for Public Policy Research. Our friend Justin Danoff, he's the shareholder activist on the right. And so with the compliant media, he goes to shareholder meetings and he takes them to task. And that's where you hear, you know, Larry Fink at BlackRock say that he could run Berkshire Hathaway better than Warren Buffett and things like that, right? But the media doesn't cover it. But I would say there's a real subtle point that we don't want to take our ball and go home. You know, one of the things that, you know, anytime, there's a rule in Washington that anytime John Kerry is near something, it's a bad idea. But John Kerry's the climate czar, whatever that is. But he and Secretary Yellen were going around sort of behind the scenes sending letters to banks and saying, don't do business with fossil fuel companies. And the State Financial Officers Foundation, of which we're close friends and supporters of, these are your state treasurers, state auditors, and whatnot. Riley Moore, who's the state treasurer in West Virginia, sent a letter to John Kerry and Secretary Yellen and said, knock it off. And then he sent a letter to the banks and said, if you play ball with them, we're taking our billions of dollars away from you. And so we should have every option on the list, but we don't want to take our ball and go home. We want to play the game the way they're playing it in some of these areas.
I have to take this opportunity to throw one more interjection in there. I mentioned we have a history of fighting these companies. We were so proud of our partners Heritage Action when they ran an ad in Game 3 of the World Series, naming and shaming Major League Baseball for having taken the All-Star game away from Atlanta. And of course, I'm sure just about everybody in this room is a Braves fan and was happy to see that Major League Baseball had to focus on Atlanta in the end.
Actually, Tommy, I hate the Braves, but on this one, I was with them.
No comment.
Maybe time for one more question from the
This is more just a comment. There's a company or organization out there called Second Vote, secondvote.com, and they actually rank different companies. So if you want to compare Nike to, you know, other sports apparel companies, you could go ahead and do that in terms of where their dollars are going in terms of funding associations or not-for-profits or organizations like Black Lives Matter. But it's called secondvote.com.
Yeah, excellent reference. Second Vote's part of our coalition. They do great work. David Black's the founder of that. Dan Grant is with Second Vote Advisors. And your first vote is at the ballot box. Your second vote is with your wallet, how you spend your money. And they do rank the companies, and they're pretty transparent about how they come up with their formulations. And it's a great way to look at how you can have impact outside of the ballot box and with the corporate America. We're running out of time, but I want to moderator's prerogative to ask each panelist to offer a closing thought here. This conversation can be, we're sort of talking about new words and new lexicon, and it can be sometimes confusing or at least make us feel like, what's the path forward? And so it may be in order here, Tommy, starting with you. What's one thing that gives you hope?
Dakota talked about the generals and the admirals appealing to wokeism. This afternoon, we're going to hear from Chairman Jim Banks, who is one of the many members of Congress that when these individuals come to testify, really hammers them and makes them own up to what they're doing virtually in private, publicly, and explain themselves. Why is this book on that reading list? Why is this requirement there? Why have you done away with this piece of the meritocracy? So yes, it exists at the top levels of the military, but the great thing about the United States government is we've got oversight, and we're going to hear from one of the best this afternoon. So that phenomenon, and especially Jim Banks, give me hope.
Mike, what gives you hope? What's one thing that gives you hope?
And the Braves.
The American people, in the late 20s, the head of the Communist Party, Lovejoy, wrote a letter to Stalin and said, there's not going to be a revolution here. The American worker is not going to revolt. And Stalin fired off a telegram back, really angry. He said, what is this American exceptionalism? It's supposed to be the first usage of the term American exceptionalism. Americans are exceptional. Americans, we're obsessive about liberty. And the American people have met what has happened in the last year. They, as I said, they haven't read Derek Bell, but they say, no, this makes absolutely no sense to me. No way, no how you're going to do this to my granddaughter. You're not going to teach my black grandchild that he could not succeed. Thank you very much. Go away. And I think the American people are going to win this one.
Thank you. Dakota, what's one thing that gives you hope?
Yeah, well, I think you're seeing a theme here. It's the common sense of the American people, right? I mean, our youth that join the military, have a variety of different kinds of smarts. Some are academically smart, some are sports smart, but they're all smart in sniffing out falsehood and pretenders, right? So they know what their experiences are and going through, again, basic training. If you can't make it over the wall, if you can't carry your buddy, in a simulated wounded exercise or something like that, they know who's being selected and promoted based on some kind of racial preference or what have you, and they won't have anything to do with it, right? So it's the common sense of Americans who have lived lives, and they compare that to some of these ideologies that are just absolutely nonsense, and they reject it. So I think that is a really optimistic note.
Thank you, gentlemen. Well, we all know that you're here for a reason, and throughout our program, I hope our vision was clear. We see and we believe in an ascendant conservative movement. We know that our solutions improve lives, not just those in this room, but every man, woman, and child across this country. We thrive on engagement in the marketplace of ideas, and that's made possible by your investment in us. And so please join me in thanking our panel, but give yourselves a round of applause for making this possible.